We come to the 10th presentation. We're looking at shared presence. And we're coming through resonant set of a harmonic to appreciate the very ancient, in fact archaic wisdom that came to a deep fruition about 4,000 years ago and mediated at that point the beginnings, the first beginnings of civilization, and the middle where the realization sprang into a new capacity with the ability to have a written language with alphabets. And that the period 2,000 years before that being the beginnings of civilization, and then 2,000 years later being the greatest transform of civilization, and our own time coming 2,000 years later makes 4 points, having 3 2,000-year periods in between them. These time periods are forms. They are forms because they have a symbolic, mental part of their cycle. In nature, in existence, there are time cycles, but they are not cycled. They are like epochs. We know that there was a sudden explosion of life forms about 500 million years ago. We know that the first traces of bacteria on our planet were about 3.3 billion years ago. These are not time cycles. But with the arrival of civilization, of the capacity to make notation, both for numeracy and for the beginnings of literacy, this was the beginnings of civilization. So civilization has an extra couple of dimensions that go along with space-time that create cycles for time. They are cyclic because there are nodes of transformation that have now been noted, and were noted quite some while ago, to reoccur, to reappear. We need to focus for our attention on a particular Greek word. That word is asketes, and asketes appears in the writings of Philo of Alexandria about the time of Jesus 2,000 years ago. We have 12 volumes like this of Philo's writings. In his writings, asketes occurs 102 times. The original usage of it comes from an understanding of Moses writing the Torah. Moses lived in the 13th century BC. So Philo is writing about 1,300 years later. And the concern is how to read Genesis, first of all, which is the beginning of the Torah, the beginning of the Bible, the beginning of a sense that there is a massive cyclic time going on immediately, that there is a rest in the universe. And that rest is the seventh day, which makes the seventh day a rest, and it is sacred because it is a space special, not a part of a cycle, but a part of the acceptance of the work done. So that the phrase, the 6 days' work, about 400 years ago, was a very esoteric phrase for those seeking then to try to appreciate where in time are we? We're in a time form. Where are we in that time form, and where's that time form in time forms? This was the age of Shakespeare, the age of Cervantes. In Philo, ascetes originally is linked back to Abraham, who had a very special rest. He was a friend of God. And that his relationality to God was that of a friend who knows him, whose presence is natural to him in his own life. And that a very special event occurs when his wife, Sarai, becomes pregnant at an old age where she could not believe that she was going to be able to have a child. And in Genesis, she laughs. And the angel who has come to tell her she's going to have a child, a son, reprimands her. Her name is going to be changed to Sarah, and the son will be called Isaac. Isaac becomes the beginning of a lineage of friends of God. Special because it is limited to being passed on only once, so it is unique. It is like a special capacity to align a frame of reference with another frame of reference so that they have a congruency in the ability to have a straight thread through the various time forms. And that this particular thread is now going to be passed on father to son, so that this will be a patriarchal line. But the common denominator of the numerator in a ratio is that while the patriarchy is the numerator, the denominator of the ratio is matriarchal. It can only be passed on by women. It can only be gathered as a blessing by the special man. And that special man then must discern that his son is capable of receiving that presence of God. The presence of God where God is a friend. Not the result of implorings, not the result of accomplishments, but because one has been passed the blessing. The women pass the way in which it comes into life, out of nature. The men pass the blessing in the way in which it becomes symbolic, in the sense that the cycle is not finished when it is complete, but just as it is complete, because the last step in the completeness is an acceptance of openness, which is given to one by the acceptance of the blessing. The blessing is to know presence rather than the present. So that time, instead of being split between the past and the future by the present, is given a flow by presence, so that the past becomes a heritage and the future becomes a promise. Otherwise, in the natural cycle, there is no heritage, there is only the inheritance. Now, those who have done my education, my learning civilization program, are familiar with the mythic horizon of tradition, where experience and images and feelings are made a part of the inheritance that one receives in your family, in your clan, in your tribe, in your geographical area, in your religion. That inheritance is something which is a part of the cycle of time, but it needs a special transform from a present moment splitting time into three to a transform of consciousness that allows for the three to become a single flow where the presence continues, so that one learns that there never was a time when God was not. It's expressed in Zarathustra's Gathas, the 31st Gatha, the fifth Hat. He's going to mention Asha, who is the feminine order of life. He's going to mention Vohuman, which is the good mind of man. And he's going to mention Mazda Ahura, who is the feminine radiance with the masculine clarity. Ahura is the Lord. Mazda is the radiant star, the sun. Now to me, choosing, reveal to me Asha's way, better known when in me is Vohuman, remembering which is my reward, the wholeness of Mazda Ahura, so that a never, neither was nor will be. Philo uses the term, the Greek term, asketes, meaning a trainer, someone who trains, and it's related to the English word athlete. He says of the third in the patriarchal line, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, that Jacob learned something new. He learned how to be asketes ton kelam. He learned how to be a trainer of himself. He learned that one doesn't just receive an inheritance, but the inheritance can be deepened to a heritage, so that now one can pass on not only that special blessing, but one can open up the whole spectrum of that blessing, so that one can pass on the spectrum to all of one's sons. So that while Isaac was not the only son of Abraham, he had 8 sons. But only Isaac received the blessing. And Isaac could only pass it on to one. He could not pass it on to the slightly older Esau, the brother of Jacob, because Jacob's mother, Rachel, did the same thing that Isaac's wife, Rebekah, had done, that she made sure that the blessing went to the right son. And the right son was her appreciation of the life energy of the young man, not on who was firstborn, who was exactly rightfully born. And so Jacob was able to pass on not only his blessing in a patriarchal way of alignment, but that all of his sons became capable of having tribes, so that the 12 tribes now distributed and had the right to have the full promise because they had the full heritage. One of those sons, Joseph, turned out to be a very special person. He had the blessing in such a way that it would have originally gone to Reuben, the first son. But Reuben, as Reuben was, got involved sexually with one of his father's 4 wives and lost the ability to receive the blessing. It's like a leak, so that the frame of reference cannot be made open. It always has an opaque quality. And so it's not a leak out, it's that it's opaqued so that it's blurred. That blessing then went to Joseph out of his secret nature that bubbled up and emerged from the heritage that he received from Rachel, and allowed him to have a very special relationship of his own that in circumstance, which you can read about in Egypt, he became capable enough to become the second most powerful man in Egypt, and he was given a wife, Asenath, who was the daughter of the head priest of the city of the sun of Heliopolis. And that by her he had 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And that when one of the 12 sons, Levi, by Moses was taken out of the regular order of the harmonic and made to receive a portion of each of the other 12 sons by taking one of the sons out, leaving only 11, one of the 11 had to be shared. The 2 sons, the tuning of it, and they were the 2 sons of Joseph and Asenath. And they were made parts of the 12 tribes then, the new transform of the 12 tribes. Asenath, in order to do this, had to be of the Semitic lineage, so that the wife of the head priest of Heliopolis, 1800 BC, was Jewish. The only Jewish woman at the time who would have qualified for that special place was the sister of the 12 sons, Dinah. And so Dinah was given in marriage to the head priest of Heliopolis. And it means that the head priest of Heliopolis, somehow in that lineage at that ancient time, already had a special quality of being worthy of her. And that all of this produced a very interesting kind of a situation. But Philo, in writing among his treatises, we're looking at one of the treatises called The Migration of Abraham, how all this started, and why it is that Jacob now is called asketes ton kalon, a trainer of himself. And the training of himself came because he had an extension of his presencing of God, that he could carry not only the presencing while he was awake and alert in his life, but he could carry it into the dream state. And that when he was doing his mother's bidding to go back to the original family in northern Mesopotamia, in Haran, and he was on his way, he had a long way to go, and the first night he spent at a place where he took a stone for a pillow, and that night he had the dream of Jacob's ladder, of angels ascending and descending on this ladder, and that he had realized that this was a new kind of a spiral cycling of capacity that was being added not to the inheritance only, but to the heritage, that now Jacob would be able to pass on not only the blessing, but the blessing with the additional dimensions of being a dream master. So that, as Philo says, Jacob became a trainer of himself. He trained himself to, as we would say colloquially, factor in dreams into the waking state, so that he became more and more capable of understanding that he could develop himself. He trained himself to realize the further dimensioning of the dream state, which had a capacity to be lifted out of the presence even into a superpresence. And that superpresence, that capacity to tap that now, went to his son Joseph, who became a dream master, and he was the first to inherit the special esketes ton kalon. He became capable of passing on that lineage of training whoever got the blessing from him to have that special capacity and to enlarge it. Later on in the migration of Abraham, though, Philo, in speaking of his own time, the time of Jesus, says that by this time, 1800 years later, the capacity had been refined and honed so that now there was such a man as the trainer of self, capital T, of self, not just of himself, but was like a special spiritual athlete who could train others to do this and could pass that blessing, that expanded capacity on to anyone who became a son. Had a relationship like the pupil to the teacher. That phrase is esketes espondesen. Ascetis espondesen means that one now is a trainer of self and one can teach this. And that this already had occurred, but that this was like the beginning of the development, sudden, of an asymptotic quality. And that there was historically a person who was the trainer of self. And while in Alexandria he was called ascetes espondesen, the trainer of self, he was called in Israel, in Palestine, the teacher of righteousness. And that the teacher of righteousness in Palestine was the founder of the Qumran community on the Dead Sea. He was the founder of the Essenes. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we know that he wrote a series of special spiritual poems called the Thanksgiving hymns. the hodeo. We also know that he went back to his original place, that he grew up in Alexandria, not in Palestine, had gone to Palestine because of the sacrilege of the temple being desecrated and made into a temple of Zeus by Antiochus IV of the Persian Empire, of the Seleucid line. And that after a while, the founding of Qumran, his special opening up of capacities, became a very difficult thing for those raised in an inheritance who expected that things to come would be from an inheritance and didn't understand, could not appreciate that it was now not only a line of inheritance on the mythic level, but was a heritage on the historical dimension. And that inheritance on the historical dimension meant that there are no limits to how many sons. And there are no limits of it just going to sons, but it can go to daughters as well. So they had trouble there. He went back to Alexandria, the teacher of righteousness, and he brought with him the Dream Master Workbook, which is the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. And so he became known in Alexandria among the population of Alexandrians as the prophet Daniel, because of the great triumph of writing the book of Daniel. But to the esoteric, Hellenistic, Jewish, refined group who were not limited to Alexandria, but went back to the place that was related to Qumran, Taposiris Magna, about 25 miles west of Alexandria. And there at Taposiris Magna was the ancient Pythagorean holy community, which now became refined about 160 BC by the teacher of righteousness become there, the trainer of self, and the Pythagorean community achieved a new kind of radiance that was a harmonic that reset the way in which time forms could be understood. And so the emphasis was on an inheritance that is able to transform into a heritage. An inheritance that is still of special origins and special developments, but now, like a cone of light, has opened up so that it will not only be a cone of light, it will illuminate the universe. And that when the universe is illuminated in this way, man will have the ability to not only factor dreams into his sense of presence, but factor the radiance of the cosmos into his life, so that man becomes cosmic friend. And in this way, if one reads Philo, he writes this way. This is why in former times they were called the prophet seers. And the trainer of self was eager to exchange ears for eyes and to see what before he heard, and going beyond the inheritance which has hearing as its source, he obtains that of which sight is the ruling principle. For the current coin of learning and teaching from which Jacob took his title is reminted into the seeing Israel, hereby to pass even the seeing of the divine light, identical with knowledge, which opens wide with the soul's eye and leads it to apprehension distinct and brilliant beyond those gained by the ears. Which means that in order to prepare yourself for this stupendous capacity, one must learn to hear first. And so the great teacher in Philo's time used the phrase over and over again, those who have ears to hear, let them hear. Jesus. The original Pythagorean introduction into the holy space of a shared presence community, refined by decades and decades of application, of development, of study, of 22 years in Egypt, 11 in Persia, already 20 in the wise Greek Aegean, coming back, and about age 56, Pythagoras finally moved to the south of Italy to develop the Pythagorean communities that were based on 5 years of weaning yourself away from having heard things wrong, to be able to learn to hear not only things that are right, but in the right way, so that one learns that one's hearing, when tuned, you hear the poetic cadence of wisdom rather than the staccato of opinion. And that when you can hear the harmonic of the poetics of wisdom, one learns that one sees within, like a third eye, which is not singular, but which is kaleidoscopic. One learns then that one sees into and through all things, and that instead of there just being letters, they make a word, and words are like crystals. One can see radiantly through the word. And so Philo uses the term here, the word, over and over again in the migration of Abraham, that once one is able to hear, one can see through the word. One can read what is written and can read it in a multiple, simultaneous way. The old way of describing it was allegory or metaphor. The better way is the way that I am teaching. It's the transparency of symbols through which you get a prismatic visioning. One sees eventually, there is no limit to how many variants one can see simultaneously. But it takes a while to prepare one's life, to prepare one's circumstance, to get ready to, I used to call it to prepare to be prepared. That possibility now becomes kaleidoscopic. Without the pacing and the preparation, a certain madness comes up. And the name of that demonic madness is legion. It's like a shattered, fractured crystal that cannot be put back together because the very structure of it keeps shattering. And any attempt to heal it creates more and more madness. The Arabic word for insanity is aziz, the buzzing of insects. Eventually that's all you hear, the buzzing of insects. So to be anxious to get the buzz, be careful you may get what you're wishing for. The clarity that comes eventually after a 5-year Pythagorean period where they were called acousmatiki, those learning to hear, they would transform from the maturity of having learned to hear from acousmatiki to mathematiki. That they were able to now see clearly in a complex ratioing, so that instead of things just being what they are ratioable, and instead of there being oneness, there was an infinite number of ratios. 1/2 and 1/2 are 1. 4 1/4 are also 1. 3/3 are 1. One learns to proportion out and to achieve a sense of a harmonic where before there was only the certainty of an identification. Now, probability and possibility are as adjunct as identification. And one can learn that the probability, if it's 99%, you don't have to force that last percent. If the possibilities are all possible, then time forms themselves and space forms themselves can be infinitely fractaled. One needs to learn then how to use the prismatic capacity to refocus by letting the inner eye see. Because the inner eye does not see in identification, it sees in terms of allness. One of the most beautiful explanations of this was done by Heinrich Zimmer in a book on art. I'll bring it next week and we'll look at those passages. If your mind sees only a repetition of what your eyes are seeing, it will seek to focus on the oneness of it, which will be the conviction that the identification of it is what is real. Whereas the identification of it in an inner sense is what already has misled you. You are not deceived by untruths, you are received by non-truths. So that one learns to see in its allness, and in yoga, in meditation, in prayer, in contemplation, one can come to see not only peripherally, not only completely, but perfectly. And Philo says, in our time, there's a step up from the trainer of self to someone who is a perfect word. We're going to take a break, and we'll come back. Let's come back to the way in which time forms differently in cycles and in an ecology. In cycles, time will repeat. And so the advantage is to have a tradition which preserves the order of the repetition, so that one knows that in spring we do this kind of ceremony, in fall we do that kind of ceremony. That as a pivot we will use the solstices, and in the winter solstice we will beseech the sun to come back, and in the summer solstice we will celebrate that it has done so, and we are appreciative. We talked last week about the Okan, about the sun dance. We mentioned at the time that in the 8-day Okan ceremony, the first thing that is constructed is the 100 Willow Sweat Lodge. And by this we have to understand that the sweat lodge is woven out of pliable young willows, 100 of them, so that the structure of it has a very deep quality of having been literally woven out of the plant life that especially accompanies streams. Willows grow by streams and things. We mentioned that the original Glastonbury community, arriving in the far west of Britain, was not England, it was Britain. About 37 BC, their first major architectural construction was using wattles instead of willows, was a woven wattle area of coming together, men and women, because they were used to coming together to celebrate the presencing that is shared among them with the divine, and gives us an indication that this group, the first group were 12, 6 men and 6 women. 4 of them were sisters of Jesus and their husbands. A 5th man was Lazarus and his sister Martha, who were brother and sister of Mary Magdalene. And the 6th was Nicodemus, who helped take Jesus down from the cross and prepare him for the tomb with Joseph of Arimathea, who was married to the youngest sister of Jesus, whose name was Susanna. The additions to the book of Daniel that are left out of most Christian texts are Susanna and the elders and Bel and the dragon. So that when you add these to the book of Daniel, you get a fuller quality here of the way in which the book of Daniel can be read, can be understood. Susanna is made to have that name, not simply because of a deep tie between Jesus and the teacher of righteousness. Jesus and the trainer of self, they're separated by roughly 150 years from the passing of the one and the birth of the other. Jesus born about 9 BC. He was born exactly at the same time that the Arapacis Augusti, Augustus's temple of universal peace, was finished in Rome, where the Via Flaminia comes down from the north of Italy and touches near the Tiber River, where there's a curve, and on that curve, if you went to the other side, you would find the Castle Sant'Angelo and the Vatican. And there's a direct line from St. Peter's skirting the Tiber that comes to the temple of the Peace of Augustus, and right across the Via Flaminia from it is the great mausoleum of Augustus Caesar. It is a geometry that is not only a sacred geometry, it is, in this case, a power of dominating the cycle of nature, whereas the weaving of the wattle church or the weaving of the 100 Willow Sweat Lodge are visionary, so that one can presume that it is not our power. It is an energy. It is an energy that has a frequency which we can understand and make use of, but it is not a power that is ours so that we have the power. We can utilize the energy without needing to have the power. And one of the great events in human history is Benjamin Franklin discovering that a universal energy called electricity is what lightning is. And it electrified the world, literally. We do not worship people who run the power plants to generate electricity. It is an energy. It is not an authority that we have the power. We don't make pilgrimages to Hoover Dam because it makes a lot of power. One of the biggest dams in the world was built in the Soviet Union near the Great Siberian city of Irkutsk. It's called Bratsk. Bratsk means brotherly. Brotherly station. It's on the Angara River, huge, powerful river like the Colorado. And a great poem was written, about a 100-page poem by Yevgeny Yevtushenko in the 60s, when they finished Bratskaya Station. It's called Bratsk Station. He has a dialogue there between the pyramid and the hydroelectric plant. The pyramid was where power was collected by one man who was powerful. I am the pharaoh. It's a universal form. The head of the Han Dynasty in China at its peak, Han Wu Ti, had 130,000 people tending every single wish he had. They work for me. Bratsk Station is a dialogue between a pyramid that accrues power for man to limit your access to the cycle. You want in, you talk to me, but not to me through who I delegate 15,000 times down because you're that little. You were born out of the sweat of slaves to people so far down my chain of command, you don't even meet them. That's how insignificant you are. Whereas the other is that this is a power station to make electricity to radiate the world with light and with service. And Yevtushenko goes down to the bowels of the hydroelectric plant where the plunge of the Great Angara falls hundreds and hundreds of feet and drives those dynamos, those turbines. And he said the sound became a throb that he could hear a word being repeated over and over again. Everything, everything, everything. And in the poem, he then has that as a refrain about every other page. Everything, everything, everything. When we free ourselves from the power of authority, we have access to tap the energy of reality. This is different. This is not on the same scale. The other, in fact, is not a scale, but is a dead geometry of command. This is a scalar of a music that can be sung to. One of the most powerful of all the time forms was established by Pythagoras. He established the cycle of the phoenix. And it was a 500-year cycle. And 500 years after he established it is the occurrence of the sighting of the phoenix in 36 AD. It appears in many writings. It appears prophetically in Ovid's Metamorphoses, finished about 8 AD, and appears rapidly after that in several other references, including Pliny, natural history, and so forth. If you compute back from 36 AD, which was when the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus occurred, you go back to a little bit after 500 BC. You go to the death of Pythagoras around 471 BC. Here's how Ovid in the Metamorphoses records it. The Metamorphoses It took him about 7 years to write, from 1 AD to about 8 AD. And when he finished it, he was seized by the power emissaries of Augustus Caesar, and he was banished in such a way that Augustus's disgusting anger was assuaged. He was sentenced to be exiled to a part of the Black Sea where no one spoke Latin or knew any of it. No one spoke Greek or knew any of it. So he was exiled to live among people that he could never talk to. It's a part of Romania now, Constanta, Romania. And he was never released from the exile. It was always a mystery, and Augustus made sure that he knew it was because of involving my profligate daughter Julia in a sex book, the Ars Harmonica Erotica, and for an error. And the error made is in the Metamorphosis, because the 15th chapter of that work is called The Doctrines of Pythagoras. And it ends with a way in which the Pythagorean community shifted to a healer community because the Apollonian sun, Helios heritage that Pythagoras exemplified became transformed into a healer thing, because the son of Apollo is Asclepius, the archetypal physician, the healer. And that archetypal healer had a special moment in the very last section of the 15th book. Is called the apotheosis of Julius Caesar. And that Julius Caesar made Octavian Augustus Caesar because his great uncle adopted him as his empire son, his imperial son. And this was the claim that Augustus used to found the Roman Empire. Whereas in the apotheosis of Julius Caesar, in the Metamorphosis, you find that he specifically there says Caesar had a son. Not an adopted son, a real son. And his son was by Cleopatra. They called him Caesarion, Little Caesar. He not only inherited the Ptolemaic dynasty that controlled Egypt and many other places centered in Alexandria, but he was the real son of Julius Caesar, the only one. He was the inheritor of the Roman Empire as well. He was murdered by Augustus Caesar's order when he was 17, when Cleopatra and the inheritor of Julius Caesar's power structure, Mark Antony, were committed suicide, defeated by Augustus Caesar. What's interesting is that Mark Antony, as a figure, was a tremendous athlete and military man. Before he married Cleopatra, he was married to the sister of Octavian, Octavia, so that Augustus Caesar's sister was the first wife of Mark Antony. They had a daughter, in fact, 2 daughters that had the same name, but the older one, the first Antonia, was one of the most learned and gentle women of that whole era. She inherited an enormous fortune and a very huge estate in Rome, never remarried again, but specialized in the humane raising of children in her home. Children, Mark Antony's and hers, and the adopted children of various people who were quite famous, quite powerful, and her fortune was managed not by somebody in Rome, but was managed by the most wealthy man in Alexandria, Philo's brother. The last name of their family was Alexander because they had been brought to Alexandria from Palestine by the order of Alexander the Great himself, because he needed to have people to run a world vision empire that he was setting up, who were experienced for several thousand years at running large, involved caravan routes everywhere from India to Ireland. And the first people to master that were the northern Semites under Sargon of Akkad. Alexander the Great comes exactly 2,000 years after Sargon of Akkad, who was the first to set up what we would call today an international civilization. It was a civilization of many languages, many religions, many forms of currency, and was the first to master how you build a matrix that extends over thousands of miles, that is able to handle business and commerce and get along with everyone by making a common denominator that they all shared in, that we are all part of the deal. We all have a cut on the deal. And the currency of the deal of that day, 2300 BC, was something we would never think of unless you knew metals. Because the little thing that makes bronze is tin. Copper you can find in lots of places. Tin is very difficult to find in quantities that you can use. And without adding tin to copper, you do not get bronze, so that the dependence of the Bronze Age is on this trigger being added to this element. It's the beginnings of understanding an alchemy. The thing later that drew Joseph of Arimathea and his business partner Nicodemus and another business partner named Lazarus was that they ran the shipping route from the old Phoenician port of Tyre all the way to the west of Britain, where the tin mines were in northern Cornwall. Even to this day, you can find West Briton or Welsh or Scots or Irish workers in metals, and they always say under their breath when they do an operation, Joseph was in the tin trade. The family that inherited the Egypt to India trade routes was the family of Philo of Alexandria and his brother Alexander. And not only were they capable in Alexandria from Alexander the Great's time, but they were the ones who spearheaded the helping of Julius Caesar in a dire strait where he could have been killed and lost everything in the Alexandrian War. And they were the ones that helped him. So they got the right to name sons. Part of the name would be Julius. And the first name would be someone current, the middle name would be Julius, and the last name would be Alexander. So that Philo's brother had two sons. They were the nephews of Philo of Alexandria. The oldest was named Marcus Julius Alexander. And the youngest was born in 14 AD when Augustus had just died and the new emperor was Tiberius Caesar. So that young baby boy was named Tiberius Julius Alexander. He grew up not only to be the governor of Egypt, he was one of the toughest military men of all time, and he was chosen as the head general for the son of the new emperor coming up, Vespasian, His son's name was Titus, and Titus, using the genius of Tiberius Julius Alexander, Philo's nephew, were the ones that laid siege to Jerusalem and obliterated it, tore it down. The end of the temple, the end of Jerusalem for many centuries came from the nephew of Philo of Alexandria. And if you look him up in the Encyclopedia Judaica, there's a little article on him and it says, but he did not follow the faith of his fathers. Because Philo expanded, because he was taught by the Word, by Jesus in Alexandria, that this is not only a universal application to all mankind, it is a cosmic application to all beings, wherever it is that they live, whatever star system. It is a cosmic harmonic. It is based on reality, not based upon any kind of finality of power, but on an infinite heritage. The linking of the cycle of the phoenix in Ovid, which caused him to be exiled because it undercut the fact that Augustus Caesar established the Roman Empire. He called it the Principate. You may say anything you wish, but you will hear me first. Then decide what you will say. It's not about a tough guy. It's about an impossible toughness. Here's the translation by a man named Melville, not Herman Melville, in the World's Classics, Ovid. This bird, phoenix, when 5 long centuries of life have passed, with claws and beak unsullied, builds a nest high in a lofty, swaying palm, and lines the nest with cassia and spikenard. Spikenard is a very complex, very expensive anointment. In the New Testament, just before the crucifixion and then the resurrection, just before the Last Supper, Mary Magdalene anoints Jesus with spikenard. It says in the Gospel of John that the fragrance penetrated the entire large house, estate. This is a cycle of the phoenix preparation, because this is the nest of rebirth. And also uses golden myrrh and shards of cinnamon. Now, myrrh only comes from one place in the world, that's southern Arabia. Cinnamon only comes from one place originally, that's Sri Lanka, Ceylon. We have to understand that there were trade routes all this time, and that the trade routes going to Ceylon, Sri Lanka, going to the Bay of Bengal, going to the Arabian Sea of India, going to southern Arabia, going to Ethiopia, coming up into the Red Sea to Egypt, were all controlled by the family of Philo of Alexandria. Because the oldest son, Marcus Julius Alexander, ran the caravan trade route to India. And the trade route went from Alexandria via the canal, the Canopus Canal, to the Nile, down the Nile, all the way to a city called Koptos by the Greeks, across the eastern desert, about 3 to 4 days by caravan, to Myos Hormos on the Red Sea, and from there down through the straits by Aden and the Horn of Africa and across the Arabian Sea, because by that time they understood how to navigate directly with the trade winds and go directly and save many, many long weeks of sailing. And the trade winds will take you to the south part of India, not to the north, but to the south part of India. And it was by that trade route that St. Thomas went to India, because he was guaranteed passage by Philo's family. And because the trade routes that went to India by Philo's family, they knew very well the trade routes going from Phoenicia to Britain and Ireland and Wales, because together they controlled the known world swath of commerce and trade. So Philo's family were very close to Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus and Lazarus, and knew very well because they were all related together through Jesus and Mary Magdalene. So the phoenix builds this nest and lines it with cassia, with spikenard, myrrh, cinnamon, bringing together the rare spices and incenses, because it is the fragrance of a healing penetration that preserves. But in this case, it settles there at ease and is so empowered in spicy perfumes, ends his lifelong span. Then from his father's body is reborn a little phoenix, so they say, to live the same long years. When time has built his strength with power to raise the weight, he lifts the nest his cradle, and his father's tomb, and carries it across the sky to reach the sun's great city, Heliopolis in Egypt. It went directly to the temple. And before the doors of the sun's holy temple lays it down, and then flies back to its natural haunts. Now, we know from ornithologists that this is a very special kind of a bird. It's a special type of pheasant. And the closest relation to it, because it is not limited to southern Arabia, also occurs in Central Asia, on the cusp between what was Persian Central Asia, ancient Iranian Central Asia, and far western China. So that you find the phoenix in the mythology of ancient Persia and ancient China as well. And the same for dragons. That you find phoenixes and dragons related together as a tuned pair. And the easiest, quickest way to understand what is the dragon is to think of the great Milky Way. In the ancient star-spangled clear sky with no electricity or smog. And it has a slight sinuous quality to it, and where the dragon Milky Way coils down closest to the horizon of the earth at midwinter, if you drop a plumb line straight down from that and take that spot and look back where in the Milky Way is this, you would come to the star Polaris, to the pole star. So that the winter solstice pivot of balance for the entire sky, all of the stars, is right here on this pivot. And there is a complement to that pivot that's offset. And that offset is a point in the sky where one can angle up at the zenith of the winter solstice. And that pivot was called El, one of the words for God in ancient times, Elohim. A New Zealand friend of mine, Peter Ballin, who did the Mayan tarot deck, among other things, years ago, when he was a young man in the South Pacific, got curious that if you run that ancient Babylonian constellation, El, through the earth, where in the southern hemisphere do you come out to? And the constellation is called, in Polynesian, Dorado, the porpoise. So that the axis of a different offset from the solstices is this El Dorado pivot, the golden man. So we have to understand that there are two related sets of harmonic. One of them goes by 500-year periods, pairing to millennium, pairing the millennium to an aeon. The other is also an aeon, having its millennium, having its cycle of the phoenix, but is offset by about 350 years. So that now you begin to understand history is an ecology of time forms that have a harmonic relationship, so that you can count. From Sargon of Akkad, 1,000 years, you come to Moses. 1,000 years, you come to Alexander the Great. 1,000 years, you come to Muhammad. So Muhammad is an aeonic figure to Moses. Alexander the Great is an aeonic figure to Sargon of Akkad. 1,000 years after Muhammad, you come to Sir Isaac Newton, the Newtonian universe, and very adjunct to it, the development of calculus. The ability to have a refined mathematical, visionary, prismatic computing that one can see, though there are an infinite number of points in between 0 and 1, and also 1 and 0, one can learn to calculate so precise that at any particular energetic understanding, one can come to it exactly. Light is so many angstroms and no more to make orange light. If you lessen it, it will become green. If you intensify it, it will become sort of red. It is a peculiar quality that we learned 350 years ago. Newton was born in 1642. We learned that we can be more exactly specific if we are not limited to an integral, if we complement it with a differential. And so there is a differential calculus and an integral calculus. Integral equations and differential equations. There's an integral geometry, there's a differential geometry. And that if we learn to tune, to pair, this all is shareable. It doesn't belong to authority. It doesn't belong to power. It doesn't belong to the powerful authority. It's free. If one can train oneself, teach oneself, and pass that on, and you can teach any number. Because they will teach any number. And it becomes an explosion of goodness. J.R.R. Tolkien, when he was writing Lord of the Rings, said the English language has the word catastrophe, but we don't have any word for the good catastrophe, so he made one up using the Greek EU. Eucatastrophe is a happy catastrophe. That there comes a moment in history when time forms are aligned for a renewal, that one can calibrate and recalibrate, and that recalibration will swiftly, in less than one generation, comb through all the snarls that have been accumulated in civilization from the beginning. 2015. More next week.